Welcome to Bryce and Rhonda Work the Case podcast.
Every week, we take a real case study from professional service engagements and break it down. What was sold, what actually happened in delivery, and the root cause of where things started to go wrong.
And we're not just talking theory here. We show how most projects break down slowly across the agreement, the milestones, the work, and the way it's managed.
So we work the case step by step to understand where it really went wrong and how to fix it.
I'm Rhonda Lee.
And I'm Bryce Holloway.
And this is the Bryce and Rhonda Work the Case podcast.
This is our first podcast. We're pretty excited to get this stuff going. Why did we decide to do this, Rhonda? Help everybody understand what we're even doing.
Honestly, I don't know that we decided. I made you.
That's true.
Bryce is a little bit here against his will, but we want to spread the good news of things that we have discovered that will help professional service firms operate more efficiently.
Yeah, that's a good way of saying that. After spending lots of years in industry for both of us in different parts, I've spent, I don't know if I want to date myself and say exactly how many years, but decades in the software development space, working for big companies, small companies, consulting firms. And I've seen a lot of good things and a lot of not so good things. And you've also got a lot of experience in organizational management and change, right?
Yep. And operations and processes and that kind of stuff. Oh my gosh, I have seen everything. It runs the gamut. The thing that strikes me the most is the solution is rather simple. It doesn't have to be as hard and as difficult as people make it out to be. The majority of time, the inefficiencies are making it more difficult than it needs to be.
That's true. One of the things I've seen over years is that, especially on larger projects, if it doesn't go 100% right, there's a lot of energy and time spent around trying to explain why it wasn't specific individual's fault. We're not trying to say, oh, there was this and that happened. If you honestly take a look at a lot of these different cases, which we'll be doing on this podcast, you should be able to see pretty quickly a certain number of very specific, predictable problems,
yes,
failures that come because decisions were made early that should have been done slightly different. That's one of the things we want to talk about in our very first opener, is to examine a specific case and talk about what went right, but also undoubtedly what went wrong and how could they have changed or fixed this. One of the things we'll start with is, this is probably something you've heard a lot in the past. I know I've heard a lot, which is a phrase that I feel like is pretty dangerous once you start working on a project for a client. When something is asked, oh, hey, can you also take a look at this? Oh yeah, sure, we can take a look at that. That's a problem.
Oh yes, because what are they saying when they say, hey, can you take a look at this? Generally, they're saying, hey, we have another problem that we didn't foresee when we originally scoped out this project.
And we'd love to slide it right into the scope.
Let's slide it right in. Hopefully nobody will notice. And unfortunately, often they don't. For example, I was working with a client and they were wanting to just become more efficient. And so we started diving into their projects, and they had this one project in particular where it was supposed to be a $180,000 project, 6 months. I think they had estimated, although it's more like guesstimated, right? Because a lot of firms don't have the tools to actually effectively estimate, but they had guesstimated a 40% margin. And in the end, they had zero margin. However, they had no idea till they brought me in months later to look at what they were doing and what their inefficiencies were.
Yeah. So let's set the stage a little bit. Don't give us the client, but what kind of company was this and what was specifically this project all about?
This was another consulting firm who did IT projects. And so they built out systems themselves, ironically. And they had brought me on to, like I said, overhaul their processes. And so, not to bag on people, but one of the biggest interesting things that I come across in my work is there are people who preach certain things, but then on the back end, they're actually doing what they preach.
I've seen a lot of that.
Yeah. So that's the situation that we had here, right? This was a consulting firm themselves. And they were doing good work. I don't want to say that this is a very common problem, so it's not specific to just this particular organization. So I came in to help them with that, and I'm excited to talk about what we found.
Okay. So set it up. What did you come in when you got there? This is a $180,000 project. It was fixed fee, which I think there's pros and cons to that
Yes.
versus an hourly billed project or case, but $180,000, they had a 6-month timeline, you said, from
Yeah.
start to
They
finish.
estimated 6-month timeline.
When were you brought in?
I was brought in after the fact. The project had already ended, as had many other projects that we audited as well. Like I
Okay.
said, we were going in and auditing. And really what I was doing was, in addition to auditing their processes, I went in and I said, look, if we had applied these things to these other projects that you've already completed, this is how much more money you would have been able to make. They like to see that kind of ROI. And so that's what I was demonstrating. One of the first things that I noticed was their guesstimation. They didn't really have anything to really estimate other than, okay, we think it'll take 6 months and we're going to have a couple of people working on it. This 180K is more than what we're paying in salary for those people. So we're good.
That's how they estimated the cost of this
Yeah.
project. It'll
And
take X amount of time and it's only 2 people. Okay.
I think you'd be surprised. That's if people are even estimating, because really a lot of firms, what they do is they say at the end of the month, at the end of the year, or at the end of the quarter, we had this amount of expenses and we had this much revenue come in, and the revenue is more than the expenses. So we made profit.
Yeah. Help me a little bit with the timeline. So that's how they got to the 180,000, right? They
Uh-huh.
said it's going to be 6, but how did they determine that it would be 6 months? And that's all. Was it something that their client said it has to be done in this amount of time and they just said, okay, we'll do that? Or did they break stuff down? Did they have some data and exploration on what needed to be done in order to reach that timeline? I'm starting to see you smile. That's making me feel like they didn't have that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It was based off of the original scope. This is what we need done. And they're like, great, that should only take us 6 months. And honestly, that's how a lot of firms do estimate. I have worked on projects where, matter of fact, I had one project in particular where it had been going for 6 months. They had made zero progress. It was literally like roaming in the desert for 6 months. And I came on and I was told, you have 3 months. I had a hard deadline because of certain things going on in their business. They needed it done in 3 months. But this particular one, they had estimated 6 months just based off of the original deliverables before the, hey, will you take a look at this too?
Yeah.
The other thing too is that most of the time when people say we're going to make this percentage of margin, they don't actually have the resources to do that. So that was another thing that I set out to do was, okay, let's actually get not just a guesstimate, let's actually determine what the margin should be. And then let's make sure that we gather that margin.
So how did they get to that timeline? Did they have a clearly defined scope?
They thought they had a clearly defined scope, and it was, had they stuck to it. That's the key, right? Do you have scope creep because somebody tries to slip something in, or do you have scope creep because it just wasn't clearly defined?
Probably more often than not, right? What I've seen a lot of is people talk about, oh, the scope creeped, but they never really had it clearly defined.
Correct. Going back to the other project that I mentioned where I came in after they had been wandering in the desert for 6 months, and I came in and was given 3 months. And I was given very specific by the person who hired me to do this. We need XYZ. So I went to the vendor that we were working with, the third party vendor that was providing services to us. At this point, I'm actually the client of the vendor. And I say, we need to make sure that we're doing XYZ because we're not. And she came back and said, that's not in scope. And I was like, how is that not in scope? That's been the main intention all along. But somehow it didn't get defined in the scope when it was originally determined. Now, again, I was brought in after the fact, right? Like I was brought in after those 6 months. So I wasn't
Yeah.
there for the creation of the scope. So we had to do a complete reiteration of the scope. It was going to be a significant amount of work. And I don't blame her because it was going to be a significant amount of work. I commend her for this because on the client end that I was working for, they were the ones who let it fall through the cracks. So it did cost them a significant amount of money, but so did the wandering in the desert for 6 months.
Sure.
There was a lot of work
Yeah.
going on there. That's a whole other story.
Sure. And this is one of the key things that I think should be a takeaway from this case in particular. If there's not a clearly defined scope in the beginning, that lack of clarity will trickle down, right? It trickles down into if you're using third party vendors, but it also trickles down into your own team, right? If they can't see the clearly defined scope of what's supposed to happen, and even maybe a breakdown of how that's supposed to go, right? Like what are the steps along the way,
Oh
the
yeah.
milestones to get there, all that kind of stuff. And so that's a huge problem.
You see it more often that it's not connected. You would be shocked at how many times I worked with a client when we're auditing the process and I say to them, okay, so what exactly are we trying to do? I'm shocked at how many people are like, oh, that's a good question. At this point, I said, okay, so I now know what you're doing. Can you tell me what it is that you're supposed to be doing? Because I want to compare it. What is it that you are agreed to do? And they said, we have no idea. We've never seen the scope of work or the statement of work. And I said, so the people who are actually boots on the ground producing the deliverables don't actually know what those deliverables are supposed to be. This is mind boggling to me. I then went on this hunt to hunt down this statement of work, and you'd be shocked at how difficult it was. I know a lot of people want to say because often money is talked about in these statement of works, right? And they don't want the people performing the work to necessarily know what the company, blah, blah, blah. I can understand that. So give them a redacted copy. That's super easy to do, but it ends up being stored somewhere completely separate. And what's actually being delivered is completely disconnected from the actual original scope of work. And most of the
Yeah.
time, the people who even agreed or negotiated the statement of work aren't even the ones managing or overseeing the ones producing it. It's absolutely insane. And you do
Yeah. And
this in bigger organizations. I will say that's more common in larger organizations.
I was just going to say, I think that
Mm.
speaks to the culture problems, right, that are in an organization, which really could be an entire
Yes.
separate
Yes.
podcast, certainly another episode or two on that. But I think that is an indication of some cultural issues in an organization, lack of trust from the top to bottom. If all of your agreements for projects or cases you're working for your clients are held in one level that none shall see or whatever,
Mhm.
becomes a huge problem. Even if it's just the next level down or whatever, there really does need to be this kind of shared understanding, clear, visible understanding of what it is that we're doing so that the individuals doing their piece of it understand not just what has to be done, not just what shouldn't be done, right? Because we want
Mhm.
to match the agreement. We don't want to do extra stuff, but so that they can understand the value they're delivering, right?
Oh,
That's part of the
absolutely.
culture of an organization. If I'm
Mhm.
working on a project or a case, I want to understand, what am I doing? What am I giving? What is my time being used for? Is it something that's valuable? I think especially these days, that's something that employees really find helpful or beneficial in their employment, right? Is to understand the value that they're giving to their clients or to the company that they're
Oh,
working.
absolutely. And in different organizations that don't necessarily have this statement of work structure, deliverables down like that, but just other organizations that have company goals, I even help them structure their goals all the way from the top, all the way down to the individual contributing employees so that the employees have an understanding of how they're contributing to the overall goals. Because usually these companies have these big, hairy, audacious goals, right? But they're so disconnected from what's actually going on. And that's when that builds that culture of distrust and really just almost hopelessness. Like, why am I even here?
So you get that from some people, right? That they'll say, "Oh, what am I even doing here?" or whatever. You'll have other people who are good workers, go getters. And so if you don't tell them what to go get, they're going to go get the thing that they
Oh, see,
think is most important for it. And I
absolutely.
think that sounds like it was part of the problem with this case as well. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there's going to be those people who are saying, we're supposed to be doing this, we think. And so this is what I think we need to do
Yep.
to hit the thing I think we're doing. Right. And so you get a lot of people who are busy, who are working, who are
Yep.
getting
Oh,
something done, but it may not actually pertain to the agreement that was originally agreed upon, which is kept in a vault somewhere by
yes.
some upper management person,
Yes.
right?
Because at the end of the day, your employees, they come in, they're paid to work. And so they, as long as they're working, they get their paycheck. So for them, if they're not given clear direction, as long as they're working, as long as they're doing something, they get a paycheck. And it's up to higher management to make sure that time is being used efficiently.
I want to jump into something that we alluded to in the beginning, that there was some scope creep involved in
Yes.
this project. So what did you find there that was around scope creep?
They were like, oh, will you take a look at this? And most organizations, they're like, sure, because they think it's good customer service. And it is. Also, we want to be clear that we aren't saying don't help your client. We're not saying that.
Right. No, absolutely. You should.
But if they say, hey, will you look at this also? It should be a red flag. There's an additional issue that wasn't initially discovered, disclosed, or whatever, known when the original statement of work was created. But what they also should think, this could potentially go one of two ways. This could potentially eat up all of our margin, or it could potentially expand our margin. Because the other thing too is I have worked with organizations that they're like, oh no, out of scope, I don't want to do it. Part of that's because they don't have a clear change management process. They don't have a clear process for being able to recapture that and use it as expanded revenue rather than just lost revenue if you take it on. So they had asked for it. It was an additional issue and it ended up adding like 3 months to the project. And that's 50% more time, right? They did not do any change of the agreement or anything, and they didn't build any additional revenue for that.
And that becomes a huge problem, right? Because
Oh, yeah.
if you have built your fixed fee amount for this particular
Yes.
case around which direction is the wind blowing estimate to begin with, and then you've added now twice the amount of time, you've destroyed any margin that you thought you had, even if
Oh,
that
absolutely.
estimated 40% in this case.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Scope creep is a funny beast, right? It starts out, I think, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes it starts out as a, hey, we have a good relationship with our client. We want to keep that relationship. They didn't have a fully defined scope to begin with. And so that's where that usually comes from, not to blame your client, but
Yeah.
they've said, oh, we've forgotten about this thing. And that happens, right?
Oh,
And so
absolutely.
as a consulting firm or whatever, we want to be able to help that client as best we
Yeah.
can. And so out of the goodness of our hearts, we bring that first one in. Oh, hey, can you take a look at this really quick? Oh, absolutely. We can do this one extra thing. Maybe that first thing takes 20 minutes. I've gotten it done. I feel like I've done a great thing for my client. We're not going to be put behind anything like that. Suddenly, though, I'm doing that. 3 other people on my team are also doing that. Our manager maybe has said, oh, sure, we can do this extra module thing, whatever pertains to this
Mhm.
case. And suddenly, without anybody having a central vision
Yep.
of what has now been extra agreed upon, we're blowing our margin. In these cases, it's all in the sense of trying to help the client.
Oh,
And that's where it
absolutely.
becomes
Yeah.
interesting.
And it's also most difficult in fixed fee base. There's pros and cons of fixed fee and hourly. And again, that could be a whole other podcast episode. You
Sure.
really want to charge for the value you are providing to your client. And that's hard to do in an hourly. So people want to go towards that fixed fee, but that's when it's really optimal to blow the budget or blow the margin, if you will, is when you've already set this fixed fee based off of early anticipated time. And now you're adding this time. If you're already hourly, yeah, you might need to tell the client, okay, this is going to add X amount of extra hours. And so so it's a little bit easier to capture it. But I know even from your experience, you've done a lot of hourly where scope expanded, so hours expanded. And when you went to the client and you said, this is how much you owe, and the client, what are you talking about? That's so much more. You end up discounting. And then
Yeah.
you're losing even more because you want to keep the relationship. So tell us about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. So it's a similar way of doing scope creep, right? Where, and I was going to mention this too. Sometimes you get the, hey, will you do this for me? We have a good relationship. Yeah, I'll do this for you. Sometimes though, you have a client that will say, oh no, they'll pretend that was an assumed part of the existing scope that was defined. And this
Yeah.
is where we come back to, is it clearly defined and how clearly defined is it? It needs to be pretty explicit. I know in the agile space for agile software development, we talk about, oh, we want to be able to change. And so we want to have loose requirements we can get going on, but then we will accept change along the way. And that's fine for the execution piece, so long as there is this understanding of that can change the agreed upon cost essentially for the project. Sure, we can handle change readily, quickly, maybe even, but that has consequences, right? In the actual engagement that's happening. And I think oftentimes that gets missed. And so when you do run into a problem where a client has said, oh no, this extra 40 hours of work or whatever to do this piece, we didn't actually mention, we just assumed you understood as part of the scope. That probably happens as often as the other part.
Yes.
You have to have the ability to say, hey, what does this truly mean? What are all the things that might go into this particular part of the scope? You can't just say, here's 5 bullet points of the things we want to get done. Great. We have to define each one of those.
Yep.
What are we really talking about? And then have a frank conversation anytime that there is an added, oh, hey, we forgot this, or do you understand that this really included XYZ? You need to be able to say, no, here's the clearly defined thing we talked
Yeah.
about originally. We didn't understand that. Maybe that's our fault. And then you can have some sort of negotiation on what difference that makes. But without that clarity, without real
Mhm.
clarity on the scope, you can run into several of those types of issues. And then it ruins a relationship when suddenly you come and say, here's the giant bill, total bill
Yeah.
for this project. Hopefully you're not waiting to bill the whole project till the end. Maybe you're doing it monthly if you're billing hourly, but you're not coming to the client later and saying, ta-da, here's this big thing. And they're
Yes.
like, oh my gosh, you got to give me a huge discount. And this is something we'll also touch on in future podcast episodes, having clarity
Mhm.
for your client
Yep.
as to the status of what's going along the
Along
way.
the
That's
yeah.
some of the insight that we're going to talk about as part of the execution chain. But without that too, your client was almost at a disadvantage if
Yes.
they're not getting regular, clear updates on how things are going and what scope you've hit so far, what's the reason behind the cost that's accumulated so far, et cetera. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways to get scope creep, and scope creep in all of its forms will cause an issue.
I wanted to mention when you're talking about being explicitly clear, I've even worked with clients who, because I am so explicitly clear, they almost push back, almost like, why do you feel the need to define things so clearly? Almost, do you not trust us? Kind of thing. I've even had people say, we've never had issues in the past. And I was like, yeah, but it just because you
Yeah.
haven't yet doesn't mean you never will. There's always a first time.
Well, that's a great question though, right? I don't think it's a great question, but it's a great question to answer.
Uh-huh.
If somebody says, why do you have to be so clear and explicit? Do you not trust us? You can answer that very clearly. No, it's not about trust. We trust you. We want to be able to do the best work we
Yep.
can for you. We want to show you we have the ability, the capacity to do this work. We want to do the best thing for you, right? We don't
Yes.
want to give you something that you'll be unhappy with and our relationship might suffer. We want this to be a good client
Yes.
relationship. We want to give you the best product that we can. And so we want to have as much clarity. And really, your agreements should include clarity along the way. If your
Yeah.
agreement doesn't include something about, as we clarify more things along the way, there will be changes or addendums to
Yeah.
this that will help us to better give you the product that you're looking for. If
And
you
then
don't have that in your agreement, I think that's a miss.
yeah, and one of the other things that I tell them is you generally have a meeting with the client, you discuss what they need and all this other stuff, and you draft up your statement of work based off of that. And I often tell them, I say, I try to be very clear because this is me telling you, this is my interpretation or this is my understanding of what you need. And so this is actually your opportunity to just say, actually, you misunderstood or to correct it to make sure that we're on the same page. Because without that clarity, so many assumptions get made and there's so much gray area and I hate gray area. I know that you can't make everything black and white, but the worst thing you can do for your clients or for yourself is leave something open to interpretation. That's where you get into trouble.
Right. Now, there may be some things, depending on the type of case you're working on, where the client says, you're an expert in this area. We want you to give us your best thoughts and maybe your interpretation of the thing we think we are asking
Yes.
for. But a lot of that interpretation should come up front, right?
Yes.
Because you should say, that sounds great. Let us go through some design with you. Let us talk about what these requirements really could turn into. There's some things maybe you haven't thought of that might be able to solve that problem that you're looking for a solution for. But you should do that up front so that you can get as much of that in the agreement as possible, as much of that in your deliverable list as possible. So there's this understanding of what all has to be done along the way. That's not to say there won't be changes. There's
Yes.
always going to be changes. That's okay. You need a good change management process.
Yeah.
You need to be honest with yourself and the client about when that needs to be triggered
Yes.
so that you can, as a consulting firm, you can make sure you're not leaving money on the table. Certainly, as in this case we're talking about, so that you don't find out that you spent more money on the case than you actually received for doing it. That would be a huge problem, I would think, if that was regular. Certainly it's a problem if it's one time, but if it's all the time, that's a problem. So you need to be able to have that understanding that we are going to make changes along the way, but we have a change process for it. And that's agreed upon.
Yeah. And it's not just an understanding, but setting that expectation. It's like remodeling a house. You start tearing out the walls and you find out you had a mold problem. Like you said, these things come up, they happen, but you cannot let these unforeseen circumstances rob you of all of your margin and your profits.
Okay. So this next piece, and let's understand, Rhonda, what were the specific problems? What are at least the key points? There's probably lots of little things, but let's talk about what the specific things were. And let me start with this idea of a project versus a case,
Yes.
at least as we've discussed ourselves and how we understand it. I'm sure there'll be lots of different opinions on this idea, but when I think of a project, it's the execution piece of the thing we're doing,
Mhm.
right? We've already agreed to do some work and now we're going to run it as a project. And there's a lot of good project management tools and practices to do that. In software specifically, there's agile practices that are good for the doing of the work and so forth. But I think sometimes people miss the idea that the entire engagement is not just the project piece, right?
Mhm.
You have to look at it as a whole case that starts at the very beginning. We talked a little bit about
Yep.
this already, with a clear agreement. And then it goes through what we've coined as the execution chain. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the
Yes.
execution chain?
Yes. So like we talked about, it starts with that agreement, getting the clarity, getting a clearly defined scope, clearly defined deliverables. What is it that you are going to give or provide to your client? This is why they have come to you. And then everything that is done related to this project needs to tie back to those deliverables. So then we take those deliverables that should be clearly defined in the agreement and we break those down into milestones. What are the milestones needed to create these deliverables? You could even go as far as breaking down some of them into phases and milestones if it's that big of a project. But oftentimes you take those deliverables and you create them into milestones. And then you break down those milestones into the tasks. These are those day-to-day things that are being done. That's the work. That's
The actual work,
the
boots on
actual
the
work.
ground. Yeah.
Exactly. That's what that is. But all too often, the people performing that work are not actually tying that work back to a milestone that's tied back to a deliverable that's clearly defined in the agreement. And that's where that
Right.
scope creep comes in. Because when you think about it, if you are doing a task related to the project, I'm saying in air quotes for those of you who aren't watching the video or just listening to us, but if the task is not tied back directly to the milestone that's tied to the deliverable, that's tied to the agreement, it is out of scope. Period.
That's where you get some of those, can you just do me this favor thing,
Yep.
right? If you're just throwing in these tasks, I'm gonna do this favor, then that's exactly where that comes from. If it can't
Yep.
be directly tied back to something already agreed upon.
All too often, they want to make some justification and it either does or it doesn't. And again, we're not saying, okay, don't do it, but we're saying you now have a choice. You can recapture that as expended revenue and expand the scope and go through the change management process. The other thing too is oftentimes people's change management process is extremely cumbersome, has a lot of friction. It'll take us longer to actually do the change process than it will to do the tasks. But
And
that,
what's funny is depending on the task, it might
yeah.
be true,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
Depending on the
yes,
task, it might be
yes,
true, but you're still missing out
you're
on
still missing out. Now, yes, maybe you do take a look at something and you determine actually this isn't really that big of a deal. It's not really a problem. Is it worth it at that point? Maybe not. But if it is something that you're like, okay, I'm going to take a look at this and now I have another huge milestone or even a whole new deliverable, right? Maybe that's even it. So when we're doing these tasks, you'd be surprised how quickly they add up. The extra meetings that you're having with your client. Now, after you're reworking the statement of work that already was executed, you're now adding a change order addendum to that. How many times do you go back and forth on that? It really can add a huge amount of time. And you're doing that over every client engagement. It really does start eating up your time.
That's true. Okay, so the execution chain starts with agreement. We
Yes.
talked about deliverables that are part of that agreement, right? These are the deliverables, and they should be defined, not just titles. They should be defined.
Correct.
This is a deliverable, what
Yes.
it means, what we're actually going to produce and deliver.
Yes.
And then that ties to milestones or phases of the project.
Uh-huh.
Or like you said, you might split that out, phases and milestones, depending on the size of this particular scope of work. Those milestones then have tasks because they should be tied to those milestones.
Correct.
What's the last part of that execution chain?
There's still two more parts to that execution chain. So then the billing, the invoicing needs to be based off of the tasks that are actually performed. If you're hourly, obviously that's a little bit easier. But if you're fixed fee, it needs to be, okay, we have performed XYZ tasks. And you also, even though you're fixed fee, you really need to keep track of how much time you're spending on these tasks, because that's really where the margin is won or lost, right? Because if you're spending so much time on a task that if performing those tasks actually costs more than what you're capturing in revenue, you would not know that if you were not tracking the amount of time you're actually spending.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point because even in any hourly billed project or case you're working for a client, you want to keep track of all of the time.
Yes.
I think that a lot of companies have a tendency when doing, especially smaller work, they have a tendency to just ignore the non-billable, right? But you really do need to keep track of, and as you mentioned with a fixed fee, that becomes particularly important to understand what are we really spending behind the scenes to get this done. And it
Yes.
can't just simply be a so-and-so gets paid this, they're going to spend 3 weeks on it. It needs to be, what are they actually doing? How much
Yep.
work is actually being spent on this thing? So keeping track of both, if you're billing hourly, the billable time, but also your non-billable time. If I'm working a case that's billed hourly and we're going to be invoicing monthly to this client, I want to understand, am I getting all of the money, the work that's been done, the time that's been spent? Or do I have people who are doing a lot of work that's not directly related to this, right?
Mhm.
So maybe my estimate was based on they're going to work on this 100% of the time.
Yep.
Maybe they're not. Maybe they're working on something else. And so that could conflict with what maybe the fixed fee was if you've done it that way, or even your estimated hours and estimated cost to the client if you're billing hourly. You've hit on a good point. It's important to capture all of the
Yep.
time. And realistically, most, if not all of your time should be billable to that
Absolutely.
project if you're working on it. If you're not, I'd be interested to hear. And maybe there's some great cases for non-billable work on a client's case. I don't know. But I would guess most of that should be tied to that, right? Then that time goes into the invoicing, which should
Uh-huh.
be clear.
Oh,
It should
absolutely.
be timely to make
Yes.
sure that you're not leaving stuff on the table.
Because oftentimes, like what you mentioned before, if you aren't making it clear ahead of time that these added tasks or requests are going to add more time and you wait till the very end and you hit them with this huge bill, they're going to push back. And oftentimes I've heard so many times, like they're giving a discount and we're not talking a couple $100, like over $100,000 discount.
Yeah, which is
That's a
crazy.
huge amount of money. Sometimes twice that much. Like that is insane to me, all because they just didn't bill in a timely amount of time and set for expectations.
And I think that goes to clarity for your client too, right? If
Mhm.
invoicing regularly, they're getting at least some sense, if they're paying attention,
Yep.
as to how much they're accruing along the way. There's a case that I'm actually excited to talk about in another episode later that deals with this in a very blatant way. Just to give you a little taste, this was a case that ended up billing over, I think the estimated original agreement was around $750,000 for this case.
Yeah.
This was definitely one of those scope creep things. Can you add this? Can you whatever? And we'll go into more detail in another episode about that. The partner in the firm who had this agreement and had this communication with the client was saying yes to all of those. And the individual workers were like, wait, we have to what? Okay. And so there was some lack of communication between the people in the firm, but there was also a lack of communication with the client because in the end, the cost was nearly double, which is a lot of money to be spending when at that level, and suddenly it's doubled. And they didn't have supposedly any idea along the way. And yeah, this huge tens of thousands of dollars discount, which regrettably for my colleague, at least in that firm, the partners had no problem passing along
Oh, yeah.
at least a good portion of that to the associates. And that can be a problem, not just for your firm, but also the people who work for you
Yep.
as to whether they want to continue. There really needs to be that clarity, right, in the invoicing.
Yeah. And the last piece of this execution chain is the insights. Even keeping track of your time is key to these insights because this is really where it's going to tell you how many resources were spent on this project or case or whatever it is that you're working and how much was captured. It also can track the productivity of your employees. Are they just coming in and putting in 2 hours worth of work in an 8-hour day? I have audited companies where once we sat down and started really looking at what their employees were doing, they were getting 2 hours worth of work done in an 8-hour day. It was shocking. And it was really infuriating to the employees that we could suddenly see that.
Yeah, I can imagine, right? But
Oh,
if
yeah.
people know that from the beginning, that
Yeah.
does actually change human behavior, right? If you know that you're being measured on
Yes.
something, it will change for most people anyways, their behavior. I think most people have a desire to do good work and to work well. And most people aren't trying to skirt the system. There are a lot of things that get in the way of our day-to-day things. But if you're able to see that, if you're keeping track of, oh, I've spent this amount of time today on this work, that can be maybe sometimes a surprise for the worker,
Yeah.
but that helps them, right? To say, oh, I maybe need to lessen some distractions or whatever.
On the flip side, it can act as a protection. It can say, no, look, you can see that I have been productive. I have put in the hours, that kind of thing. So it can actually be for those employees who, like you said, the majority of the employees do want to do a good job. It actually is somewhat of a protection for them.
Yeah. And I think it's also, so if I'm working on a case and I'm trying to work my hardest on it, I'm giving my all to it or whatever, I think there is a bit of comfortable feeling to know that others, because we've all worked with them,
Huh?
those few people who don't,
Yes.
who
Yeah.
they're at their phone, who have other distractions in their day, to make sure that's seen, to say,
Yeah.
look,
Yeah.
I'm actually trying to work. I'm not trying to throw this guy under the bus, but you can see the difference, right? And so I
Yeah.
think having that visibility is pretty key. Okay. So we've talked about the execution chain: agreement, deliverable, milestones, tasks, time, invoice, insight. Across that entire thing, give us the high level biggest problems, the top three, let's say,
Oh,
because there were clearly more than that in this case.
yeah.
Give us the top three. What do you think were the top three issues in
The
this
top three
case?
issues were, first of all, they had no change management process. They had no way to recapture scope creep as to expand their revenue. That was their first biggest issue. And so it was either, okay, are we going to do this or are we not? So are we going to help the client, or are we going to tell the client we can't do this and possibly hurt the relationship? So that was number one. Number two was they were guesstimating. They guesstimated their margins. They guesstimated the amount of time that it would take, because they did not have a system in order to do that. They didn't have any system to calculate that, to track that. And so that was the second key issue. And then the third one, and really maybe I should have mentioned this as the first one, but at the end of the day, the original agreement was hidden away where the boots on the ground couldn't see it. So when somebody came in and said, hey, will you take a look at this? They're like, sure. Because as far as they're concerned, their objective is to help the client. They don't necessarily know all of the specific deliverables or non-deliverables.
Yeah. I think you might be right. The third one you mentioned probably is the bigger one, right? And I say that because I think it trickles down. If you look at the execution chain from the start of the agreement, if you have problems there, you're going to have problems down the line, right? If your agreement is not really known by everybody on the project or the case, then you're going to run into problems, right? That creates issues for your deliverables and your milestones. It creates issues for the people doing the actual work, getting the tasks done.
Yep.
If they don't understand what they're even supposed to be doing and what was agreed upon as far as timing and all those types of things, because that really affects how you're planning the execution along the way. So I agree. I think a non-clear
Yes.
agreement, not a clear list of deliverables, is definitely contributed maybe the most to this particular issue.
Yeah. And if anybody who's worked with me, they know that my favorite question to ask is, help me understand why it is that you're doing that. And it's not to question why they're doing it. It's to understand if they understand why they're doing it. You would be shocked at how many times the answer is, I don't know. That's just what I was told to do. And that to me is sad, because these are your boots on the ground. If they don't know the end objective, then how can they flag up to you that there's issues?
Right. Because
You-
they don't actually know how it's different from what you're
Yeah,
supposed to be doing.
exactly.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that's sad when they don't have that visibility. I think it's also very dangerous, right?
Oh,
Because it can cause a lot of bloat, it can cause a lot of
oh,
scope creep, which we're talking about specifically, but it can cause major problems across the entire length of that engagement. So the biggest takeaways from this project are what?
clear agreement that is visible to all involved in the project.
So
right?
even if you have to redact sensitive parts of it, which
Exactly.
is understandable depending on the type of work you're doing, that needs to be visible across the entire group, the entire team
Yes.
working on that case. Second takeaway?
Second takeaway is every task that is done needs to be tied back to a deliverable from within that statement of work. Bottom line is, if the task is not tied back to the deliverable, you're probably doing it for free.
Which is terrible.
Unless you're a nonprofit, you need to be making profit.
That don't work for free.
And then they also need to have a way to track time spent on it, expenses, all of these things, because that's where they're going to be able to view these insights as to whether they're actually profitable, where problems have occurred. Because the other thing too that you want to gain from these insights is, how can we work more efficiently in future cases? The worst thing you could do is to just continue those bad habits.
So let's talk really quickly about a solution that we've developed that we're particularly proud of, that will help with a lot of these issues we've just talked about with this inaugural case we've investigated.
As I have worked with various clients, and develop this execution chain, it has been frustrating for me because oftentimes the systems that they use are very rigid and force them into specific processes that are often inefficient. That's a whole other podcast as to why that is. But the bottom line is they are usually inefficient. I have always wanted to have a system that could manage these projects according to the execution chain. That's why the casework is so amazing. I'm so excited about it because it's finally the system that I have always wanted for my clients. It outlines the execution chain very clearly. It gathers those insights so that you can tell if you are profitable or not. It also has a very clear change management process for you to expand your revenue when you have scope creep.
I'm also really excited about this too, because through my career, I've seen, especially in consulting, there's tools out there, but they're essentially a lot of disparate systems where we keep track of time over here. To be honest, there's a lot of keeping track of scope and deliverables, maybe if you're keeping track of it in Word docs and rich text format things I've seen. It sounds ridiculous, to be honest, especially in the technology area, right? To have people who are not using good technology tools to
Yes.
keep track of their projects to help people use better technology tools. But that's one of the exciting things about this solution, the casework that we've developed, because it takes all of those pieces that we just discussed, each piece along the entire execution chain, and helps you to keep track of those in one centralized solution, right? You've got your engagement agreement, you've got some change management to make sure that you are capturing those changes. And we're helping you keep track of that along the way, keep track of your deliverables and your milestones that meet that agreement, and the tasks and all the things that go into a case, keeping track of documents, notes on a case, which are so vital. And then also being able to keep track of your crucial billable, non-billable time, expenses that you might incur as part of doing the work. Then even invoicing and some insights across not just individual cases, but across clients to be able to tell, how have we been doing across one particular client? We've done 5 to 10 cases for them, and this is how we've done. And some of them have been really profitable and some haven't. Some have stalled. Why have they stalled? So there's a lot of things that we're able to help you to see as part of the casework.
Part of our insights engine helps us identify what is going wrong, what is drifting, what is out of scope, what is bottlenecked, how much is it going to cost you, and most importantly, what to do next, what to do about it, how to fix it. Because a lot of organizations, even if they're able to identify what's wrong, they don't always know what to do to fix it.
It's crucial to have all those pieces together so that you can more effectively, more efficiently work these cases. And that also translates into dollars, which is the whole reason we're in business. So we're really excited about that. The casework is up now and ready for our initial cohort of beta testers. If you've experienced problems like we've discussed today, and you're interested in a solution, or at least trying out some solution that might help with those issues for the work you're doing, and we're targeting really professional services firms, consulting firms, any kind of group that does work that has a start and an end for a client. If you're interested in being a part of that, come join us. Come to thecasework.com and you can sign up. Just join the beta. There's several buttons there for you to join our beta, and then we'll be in touch. And thanks for joining us on our initial podcast. We're excited to keep this going and talk about, there are tons, by the way, of projects or cases out there that have been some very dysfunctional and some have a few problems. And we're hoping to talk about a number of those along the way. We hope that you'll join us.
And the next podcast, we're going to talk more about the project that I mentioned earlier, where they were wandering in the desert for 6 months and then they brought me on and I had a 3-month deadline. So we're going to talk about everything that went wrong with that project. And there's a lot.
I bet. We're going to dig in. So join us back and we'll continue the conversation.
All right. That's the case for this week.
In our next episode, we'll work another engagement and break down the next layer of where execution started to slip and what should have been caught earlier.
If you're seeing versions of this work in your own work, you're not alone. Make sure you're subscribed to the Bryce and Rhonda Work the Case podcast so you don't miss what comes next.
And if you want the full written breakdown, you can find our Working the Case newsletter on LinkedIn, where we introduce and go deeper into each of these engagements.
So make sure you're subscribed there as well.
See you later.